Hi, thank you all for joining us today, for tuning in from wherever you are. We are happy to be able to have this conversation. We were originally looking forward very much to being able to join with many of you during the South by Southwest conference, but are happy to be able to do this virtual session. And I want to thank the panelists, certainly, who have made time in their schedules and their remote work to be able to have this conversation. Let me first introduce the people that we have. I am, first of all, Amy Mitchell. I direct the journalism and news and information research here at the Pew Research Center. Are happy to be able to host this session today. We also have Philip Howard, who is a professor and a writer. He teaches at the University of Oxford, directs the Oxford Internet Institute, and is a statutory professor at Beloit College. He writes about information politics and international affairs and is the author of 8 books, including The Managed Citizen, Pax Technica, How the Internet of Things May Set Us Free or Lock Us Up, and most recently, Computational Propaganda. We also have with us Jane Lytvynenko. Jane is a reporter with BuzzFeed News, where she covers online misinformation. Her work investigates the spread of fake news, of digital deception, and the rise of hyperpartisanship online. Jane has exposed state-sponsored disinformation operations, written about illegal online drug sales, and uncovered networks of fake accounts using social media to dupe users and profit from the online ecosystems. And finally, we have Lori Robertson. Lori is a journalist who previously covered the media for 9 years as an editor and writer for American Journalism Review. That's a bi-monthly media watchdog magazine. That was prior to joining factcheck.org in 2007, where she remains now. At AJR, she won the Bart Richards Award for Media Criticism and an honorable mention in the National Press Club's Arthur Rose Award. Thank you all for joining us. I look forward to hearing from you and having a really interesting discussion about the challenges that we face in the space around misinformation, the 2020 US election, and then now also the coronavirus outbreak worldwide. I will kick off by sharing some data that we have collected in what are conversations and surveys with the US public in particular. We'll then look forward to hearing some opening remarks from the other panelists and entering into conversation. So first of all, and one of the things that we've seen in our work is that US adults, and most of this research is looking at Americans as opposed to some of the international work that we do. But we do see that US adults see this made up news and information as a real critical problem. 50% say that it's a very big problem in the country today, and that places it higher than several other types of issues such as racism, illegal immigration. It comes in just slightly below things like the affordability of healthcare, and is about on par with the US political system and the gap between the rich and poor. We also had 68% of US adults say it has had a big impact on Americans' confidence in government. About half that say it has greatly impacted Americans' confidence in each other, and then also in political leaders' ability to get work done. When we ask specifically about the election, we again see high levels of concern, with about half who say they're very concerned and another quarter at least somewhat concerned. We see that the concern, the high concern level, cuts pretty evenly across both parties. So if you ask people of the Republican and Democratic Party, they're both highly concerned, but we do also see that most feel that it's going to impact their party more so than the other party. We also look at sort of the level of concern based on the type of platform or pathway you prefer for your news, and we actually see that those who most commonly get political news through social media express lower levels of concern than those who go through some other pathway, such as television or websites even. And when we think about the kind of impact this can have, so what does this add up to, right? When you think about the election, all in all, there's sort of the overarching question of to what degree will Americans accept the results of the election? And that's split about 50-50, where you have only about half that say they have at least a fair amount of confidence, only 11% that have a great deal of confidence that the American people will accept the results of the election. And the other half saying they don't have much confidence. Now we think about how this transitions to the COVID-19 crisis, the coronavirus outbreak. And we see very similar levels of concern, about half that say that it's caused a great deal of confusion about the basic facts of the situation. And again, more than another third that say it's caused some. So people feeling really a sense of confusion about the facts of this. But most Americans have seen at least some have come across some made up news and information about COVID-19 specifically. And when we ask about this, it is important we do specify sort of things that they feel are completely made up. And when we ask them, we follow up. If they say they've seen something, to ask them to sort of open it in an open end, to write in a specific claim that they saw that they thought was completely made up. And we see a pretty wide range. And I think this speaks to some of the challenges of addressing the question of made up news and misinformation and how the public may evaluate it as well, which I'm interested in hearing about more from the panelists. So 41% wrote in something that had to do with the magnitude of the risks, either saying they were greatly exaggerated, that when people said the risks were super high, they really weren't, they're really low, or vice versa. Details about the virus, another 30%. Politicians' responses that people were saying were made up, another 10%. And to just sort of give you an example of some of the breakdown of that, if you look at that, within that 30% that were the details about the virus, so about 12% that said it had to do with something with the creation of the origin, the cures for it, another 4% ways to prevent it. So a wide range of things that people are believing to be completely made up. And we did also then ask some specific questions about what people's perceptions are. And the data are quite interesting when you look at these as well. We asked people, and this survey was done in also, it's worth noting the timing of these surveys, which were done March 10 to 16. And so it was at a fairly early period of the outbreak, at least where the US was focused on it. And when we ask adults what the most likely origin, so how it actually came about, 43% say it came about naturally, which is about, has been in line with most health experts in terms of what they're saying. You have about a quarter, 23%, that say it was developed intentionally in a lab, and 6% that say it was made accidentally in a lab. But you also have a quarter of the population that say they're not sure what happened, partly perhaps because there's so much different information that they're coming across. And in another question, we asked about the availability of a vaccine, which was a big part of the conversation in the US during these weeks. And about half that say the availability will be in a year or more, which is again what most health experts had been saying and were publicly saying at that time. And about a quarter that gave a different type of answer, available in the next few months, available now. And again, 23% that say they're not sure. And then you can look, and there are certainly party differences in these responses, with Democrats more likely to say that the origin came about naturally, whereas Republicans are more likely to say it was developed intentionally in a lab. And similar differences here when we ask about the availability of the vaccine. And one of the interesting things, which I didn't put in a slide here because it's kind of complicated for opening remarks, but we also looked at this within party based on your media diet and where people turn for news and information, certainly shows additional differences even within party in terms of their responses to these questions. So we have seen in a good portion of our research that where people are turning for news has an impact or connects to their responses to certain types of perception, information, and things that they may have heard about or not heard about. And then finally, in a more recent survey, and this one was done April 20 to 26, we asked to get a sense of the reach of certain types of false or yet unproven claims that have been out there. And you see the one that's been was heard about the most by Americans during this time was the claim of hydroxychloroquine being used as a treatment. About 30% that had heard a lot about the plasma transfusions as a treatment. And then you do go further down as we ask about other areas. But this, to us can be a helpful way to get a sense of the reach, and then the reach within different parts of the populations if you dig deeper into that data. And then I'll just end with saying, amid all of this and the sort of the confusion and what people are coming across, there's also so much that's coming at people. It's such a constant sort of evolving stream of news and information that it's a lot for Americans and for anybody, obviously, to be able to digest and keep up with. And we found 71% that say they need to take breaks from COVID-19 news from time to time. And I am going to end it. So as we think about sort of that impact, you're overwhelmed, there's so much that's coming at you. How do you sift through and make sense of what's there? So I will end it there and turn it over to Philip Howard, who's going to share some of his data. Philip, I think you're muted.
Easily fixed.
There you go.
Thank you. Now I'll share my presentation. How does that look?
We cannot see it.
Let's see. Share.
Share content.
Share content. Yeah.
Perfect. It's about to come up.
Excellent.
It just went away.
Share content. There we go. So while I'm sharing, I'll talk through what I hope I'm going to share with you. This is the presentation that goes along with a new book. Thank you for the handoff, Amy. I think you've touched on several interesting themes, and what I'm going to try to do for my 7 minutes is talk a little bit about some of the big mechanisms behind misinformation. This is the best kind of book from my point of view as an author, in the sense that it's done. There's not much I can do to change it. And what it does is go into the big mechanism of technologies and media systems that produce so much misinformation. I have a small team of about a dozen people. Our goal is to try to address public policy problems and improve civic engagement through data science. Often this means scooping large amounts of social media data to study who's learning what, where the information is coming from. And I define a lie machine as a set of systems and organizations and technologies. We're taking a lie, an untrue claim, and putting it into the service of some ideology. So much of the misinformation that we encounter in public life is not just produced for a lark or as a joke. There's a project behind it, and it's often a fairly large team behind the production of such lies. There's usually a production team, a distribution team, a marketing team. Sometimes these teams involve hundreds of people spread over multiple countries, working across multiple time zones. To give you a taste of how big these kinds of teams are and these mechanisms are, I want to show you a few figures from the analysis we did for the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence about Russian-generated misinformation from the 2016 election. We were presented with several unique data sets, Facebook data, YouTube data, and Instagram data that showed what American users were getting, social media users were getting in the lead up to the 2016 election. And this figure is a fairly straightforward graphic. These are the Russian accounts, known Russian accounts, clearly managed from St. Petersburg. that went to work in the 2016 election and afterwards. The first natural observation is that the peak of Russian activity, the peaks, the days of large amounts of activity, are pegged to the days in the electoral calendar. They're the days when presidential candidates debate. They're the days when there's a major convention, the DNC, the RNC. So looking ahead to 2020, we can imagine that the same kinds of political actors will be spreading misinformation during the 2020 debates, during the 2020 RNC and DNC. Now, for me, the important lesson from this graphic is actually towards the right end of the figure. The bulk of Russian activity on Facebook occurred after the 2016 election, not before. It was almost as if foreign actors decided that the IRA in Russia decided that they'd had some impact in 2016 and doubled down with more resources, more money, more people. The bulk of the activity is after the voting day in 2016. The other interesting thing we found in the data was this sort of migration from Facebook onto Instagram as the platform of choice. So, there's generational effects to social media. People younger than us are on Instagram. The people younger than them are on TikTok and a range of platforms we've never even heard of. This is important because young people form their political identities over social media now, and at least several international state-backed agencies are targeting young people not on Facebook or Twitter, but on Instagram with visual misinformation in creative ways. Now, the content, the stuff that people push as misinformation is often race-based. It's polarizing issues around gun control or abortion. That's the same kinds of issues that have polarized the American public for a long time. But these issues are purposefully chosen as content for a misinformation campaign. At this point, I think it's safe to say that every national security crisis, every budget bill, every tax bill will come with some kind of misinformation campaign for it or against it. Corporate actors, civil society groups, foreign governments, there's quite a range of different groups that do this work. China, in the last 6 months, has begun a significant campaign of misinformation in English. It began first around the Hong Kong protests. That was the first time we saw China being interested in what English language social media users were thinking. But now during COVID, they've flexed their muscles again with misinformation, mostly to try and prevent us from calling it the Wuhan virus, right? I think there'll be special interest groups using more and more misinformation. And so far, we haven't seen true artificial intelligence behind misinformation. I would say that that's on the horizon. If a political campaign consultant can figure out what kinds of face or skin tone or gender you'll react well to, and marry that in some way with content from your social media feed or data from your credit card records, they'll figure out how to exploit that and make that something, an important part of the campaign for misinformation. There are a couple of tricks in the policy domain that I think we could do, not tricks, some serious policy innovations that would help curb the problem of misinformation in political life. And I want to say that there are still important reasons to do this work. I think existentially, it's getting very draining to study all the different kinds of misinformation that are out there and all the different sources of misinformation. But I still believe in truths and that truths are valuable. And I just want to end with this figure on some of our COVID work. We've started looking at how misinformation gets consumed around the world and have found that the state-backed actors, this is mostly Russia Today, CGTN, the Chinese and Russian origin actors, have a much wider reach than even the best of the most professional news outlets. In this case, last week's analysis found that these two news providers, RT and CGTN, reach almost 1 billion social media user accounts in English. This is content in English. In English. And on average, junk news outlets that are clearly producing health misinformation reach a competitive market with the New York Times and CNN. So it's a fairly significant problem. There are definitely some policy solutions, and I think it's important to keep talking about what those solutions can be so we can fix them in time, actually, well before November 2020. I'll share back. Thanks, everywhere. Looking forward to a good conversation.
Thank you so much, Philip. That was really interesting. And we will go now to Jane and hear some of Jane's thoughts about work at BuzzFeed and how one goes about reporting this. Thank you, Jane.
Hi. See my presentation okay? Give it a moment.
It is loading. It should come in just a minute, I think. There we go. Yep.
Hallelujah, we made it. So, in reporting on disinformation, early on back in 2016, really the primary conversation was Russian trolls, which is what you see on screen right now. These are quite literally Russian trolls running in to work to make it on time. But in the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen a real evolution in the way that disinformation is produced and the way that disinformation is spread. So I really want to dig into COVID in a second, but it's also really important to highlight some of the research that we found before the pandemic started. Um, right before the pandemic, we were looking at PR firms that are now professionally producing disinformation and social media manipulation as a service. And what we found is that disinformation, misinformation, and online media manipulation is an effective business model around the world. There are professional PR companies globally that are working for both possible state actors. Of course, attribution is extremely difficult for us in this space, but also for individual politicians and individuals overall who are seeking to promote their narrative online outside of traditional means. A lot of these farms, these bot farms, troll farms, whichever term you prefer, um, tend to employ low-paid employees. Farm in Poland employed people with disabilities because they were able to be paid less. In Ukraine, we saw students take on spreading misinformation as a summer job. So this is becoming a real market that before might not necessarily have existed to the same degree. And part of that is part of that worry is that the online information market can get quite saturated. And we've seen a lot of this with coronavirus disinformation. Now, I really want to be careful here and say that we haven't seen evidence of troll farms used for English language mis and disinformation at this very moment. But we've also been deeply inundated with the amount of mis and disinformation around the coronavirus, and many researchers have not necessarily had the chance to look at the big picture. So for us, there are three different areas that we look at when reporting about mis and disinformation. And sometimes those areas overlap. So those areas are health. This is everything from false health cures to bad scientific health advice. Tech, the primary narrative there is that 5G spreads the coronavirus, which is of course false. And we see politics. For instance, in the US, we've seen a lot of undermining of Dr. Fauci using sort of trumped up narratives that are taking a lot of information out of context. And many times the mis and disinformation that we see about the coronavirus is essentially at the center of the Venn diagram of these three subjects. A great example of that, an example of that is the video pandemic, which mentioned all three of these areas and achieved incredible popularity on social media by first being uploaded to YouTube and then popularized through Facebook. It's also important to know that it was on virtually every social media platform that we attempted to find it on. So these narratives are effective, and they're very often are combining conspiratorial communities that previously were a little bit more siloed than they are now. There's also a couple of other characteristics that I really want to highlight. One is that disinformation has crossed borders. And not only has it crossed borders in English-speaking countries, it has crossed borders internationally. So very often we see the same hoax being repeated in different languages all around the world, circulating across social media. We also see same types of hoaxes, even if it's not the exact same wording. So for instance, early on in March, we saw videos showing military vehicles and military equipment. Some of them were out of date. We saw this in Canada, in the UK, in Australia. So these hoaxes have really crossed the whatever border divides that we previously had. And here's authorities in various countries having to refute essentially the same narrative. We also see a lot of adaptation of narratives. One of the earliest ones that we saw is one is about the now infamous narrative that coronavirus was created in a lab. That was pushed as early as January and really was popularized by the Daily Mail before it was picked up by political actors. But this adaptation of narratives has really seen conspiratorial communities and known bad actors sort of pick it up and push it further to their audiences, as we have seen in the last few years. So the cycle that we have been reporting on over the last 3 years or so has not been broken. And of course, really important to note that there is no science that shows that the coronavirus was created in a lab. And one last thing I want to highlight is that the coronavirus really shows how a message can be reproduced and redistributed over and over and over again. We've seen this over the course of the last 3 months. Recirculation and recycling of old hoaxes globally. This is research from First Draft from a few years ago that showed that this is a problem, and this continues to be a problem, a huge problem with the coronavirus. While we're here, I really want to mention a project that I was extremely happy to contribute to. This was for reporters and researchers who are looking at disinformation. This just came out in April during the pandemic, describing how we research a lot of the mis and disinformation that we have put forward because of the evolution that we talked about at the beginning. So I'd really recommend for anybody interested to look at this manual that was put together by my colleague, Silverman. So that is generally what we've seen in our reporting on disinformation. I think a lot of similar points to what other panelists have mentioned, and I'll pass it on now if I can find the right.
Thank you so much, Jane. Really appreciate it. Now we will turn to Lori, who can share some perspective as one who is seeking to fact check and organize fact checks around misinformation. Thank you, Lori.
Thank you. Okay, so I just wanted to mention factcheck.org. We were founded in 2003. We're a project of the Annenberg Public Policy Center at the University of Pennsylvania. Our mission is to reduce the level of deception and confusion in U.S. politics. We do that primarily by monitoring political speeches, ads, Twitter accounts, any kind of form of communication. And in addition to that, we monitor and write about viral misinformation. These types of claims we've been looking at since about 2004, the year after we were first founded, and it used to be viral emails, anonymous emails, but now, as we've talked about today, we are primarily seeing these claims spread through social media. So in December 2016, after the 2016 election, our organization and other fact-checking organizations entered into a partnership with Facebook to attempt to reduce the spread of this misinformation on that social platform. You may know Facebook also owns Instagram, so this work is also being done through Instagram. So users can flag posts, and I'm not sure a lot of Facebook and Instagram users are aware of this, but on Facebook, there are 3 little dots in the upper right-hand corner. If you click on that, you can hit flag post and report things that you believe may be false news. Those things that are flagged both by users and Facebook itself appear in kind of a database that we and other fact checkers can access to see what people are flagging and what's going around on Facebook and Instagram. And then we look into them. If we find that things are false or partly false or the headline is false, users will get a warning in their newsfeed about that. So this first slide shows sort of the evolution of how these things have been flagged in people's newsfeeds. So back in 2017, you can see that you would get a little kind of caution flag, and it would say disputed by factcheck.org or whatever organization had written about it, and you could click on that for more information. By 2019, these posts were showing up in a little related articles box. And then in 2020, and I think this is clearly the best iteration of this yet, we're seeing a lot of claims spread through images and videos. And now, once we find that there's false information in that, the screen is darkened. So the users can't really see it very well on their screen, and there's a warning that says this contains false information, according to independent fact checkers. You can eventually see the post. You can kind of scroll down, and there's a little eyeball and a thing that says see the photo, but you really can't get by that warning before you do that. And you can still share it, but when you go to do that, you get another pop-up warning saying this has been fact-checked by independent fact checkers, and then you can hit share anyway. So a couple, sort of roadblocks along the way to continuing to spread this information on Facebook. I went through our coverage this year and identified a couple different types of misinformation that we're seeing, and I think this really holds for past election years as well. It's not something unique to 2020. One type of claim that we see a lot of are claims that tap into someone's usually political predisposition. So there's a couple examples on the screen here. One, an Instagram post about an Alabama abortion law, and it misleadingly gave information that was incorrect about what that law would have done. Another example, this was one of our most popular stories of the year, actually claiming falsely that Bernie Sanders wanted to tax income above $29,000 at a rate of 52%. Another type of misinformation, and we've clearly seen this a lot with the coronavirus, tapping into fears. We've seen a lot of, bogus cures or claims that a vaccine already exists, but it's a vaccine related to a coronavirus that appears in dogs, things like that. And then this example, more of a conspiracy theory claiming that the Gates Foundation had made predictions about this particular virus. Another type we see is sort of satire, which I've included in quotes here because whether or not it's really funny is clearly a matter of opinion, gone viral. So there's a lot of websites out there. They claim they're satire. They have disclaimers on their website. If people clicked on the headline, they could see disclaimers that just flat out admit we made this stuff up. But a lot of people, of course, don't click through on the headline. And then what happens is that other websites or Facebook users and groups repost that information. And even if you wanted to go find a disclaimer, you're not going to find one. So an example of that is this false claim that Pelosi wanted to take Social Security money to pay for the impeachment inquiry. And another example are claims never die. Sometimes we call these zombie claims. So the Pelosi story we did in October, 3 months later, somebody took that story and made a YouTube video out of it. And when we contacted the guy who made the YouTube video, he took it down, but it was kind of too late. And the false headlines about the video, even though you couldn't see the video anymore on Facebook, you could still see the false headlines about the video. A second example of that, there was a Twitter user who created this fake newspaper clip, completely fabricated, and admitted repeatedly that he made this up and that it was supposed to be a joke, claiming that Pete Buttigieg, when he was a teenager, was arrested for killing dogs. So he totally made it up. Admitted that, said it on Twitter, but it didn't matter. Once it was out there, thousands of people shared it. And it just goes to show that even when the creators of this information admit it's wrong or take it down, these claims just continue to live on. A couple of examples of some other efforts to kind of stop misinformation, and they've popped up in April, really in response to the coronavirus. So one, Google News is now featuring fact checks on the coronavirus, really focusing on health claims or bogus claims about cures or other information that could be harmful to people in their health. So if you go to their COVID topic page, there's now this fact check box. YouTube is also now surfacing fact checks in searches. So if you're searching for certain information and there's a related fact check, you may see a link to information about that. And it's focusing on the coronavirus, but that'll go on and pertain to other topics as well. One of the things we saw in 2016, and we've already seen evidence of this in 2020, are efforts to mimic actual news sites. So this was an example from North Carolina, where a page that created made-up news, and then to sort of trick people even more, or confuse people more, there was a mix of real news and then made-up news on the site that was created to mimic what a real newspaper site would look like. Facebook took that down, but they were able to create another site, and I think it just shows the difficulty and the challenge for readers to quickly assess whether or not something is a reliable source of information. And I'll go through these quickly. On our website, we have a couple resources to try to help people to spot misinformation. We say that readers are really the first line of defense against this. If we can stop people from spreading it, obviously it cuts down on the spread of misinformation. We have an article on tips and also a video. So just a few things here to consider: the source of the information. Read beyond the headline. There's often clues within these stories that it was supposed to be some kind of joke or that this is not legitimate. Check the author. There's often clues there that this was not really written by somebody who was a journalist. What's the support for the claim? You can often do some really quick fact checking of your own online. Check the date. We see old stories pushed as if it's something new, and it's not. There is legitimate satire out there. We've been asked several times by readers about Andy Borowitz's work with The New Yorker, which is labeled satire, and we'll still get asked, hey, is this really true? Check your biases. So that kind of goes back to this tapping into predispositions. Are you like gung-ho to share something automatically because it really tapped into something that you believe? And then consult the fact checkers. We know people don't have time to do all these little things, but when you're seeing a false claim or a suspect claim online, most likely we or another fact-checking organization or news organization has already written about it. So a quick Google search can really turn up those fact-checking stories very quickly. And that is it.
Thank you so much, Jane. This is all, it's just fascinating, and you each really bring a different perspective to the challenge of this arena, and are focusing on different areas of it. I'd love to start with sort of just a question to each of you about first of all, what you would say is the most challenging aspect of trying to get a handle on misinformation in the ways that you're addressing it. And then the second part of that question would be, to what extent does it differ by topic? So for example, the approach, what you're seeing when it comes to election 2020 compared with what you're seeing when it comes to COVID-19 news, and you're trying to keep up with a pandemic as it's developing and as things are happening. So I'd be curious from each of your perspectives about what really you find most challenging today and how different it is to be tackling this around different topic areas?
So I could offer a start. I think for me, the real challenge is the verification, right? Figuring out who is actually behind a story and where they're sitting. And this is why, in part, why Jane's work at BuzzFeed is so important. It's possible to scrape a huge amount of data from a social media platform and figure out what story is diffusing, but then actually tracing back the money trail is that's very difficult work. One of the surprises for me over the last few years has been this change from misinformation being something that trolls do in other countries to being something that white supremacists, ultra conservatives, extremists in our democracies generate for themselves. That's been a big change. And of course, now, as you say, Amy, with COVID, it's major state-backed media organizations from China and Russia that are generating the volume of stuff we have to put up with.
Jane or Lori have thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I had a couple of thoughts. With the coronavirus, it's been interesting. It is a story that is changing, and we're learning about, and some of the information and knowledge that we're learning about the virus keeps increasing. So it has been a difficult story to cover. One thing that we've relied on more in dealing with viral misinformation is our science writer. So we have a science writer on staff, and that's been very helpful with some of the claims that we're seeing surrounding the coronavirus. And the other thing I would add for us, we want to strike a balance between quickly shooting down and debunking false information, but also not essentially promoting the false information if not that many people have seen it. So that's one of the challenges too. We don't want to write about a claim and now more people will be exposed to the claim by virtue of us writing about it if it's not something that a lot of people had seen to begin with.
Yeah, for us, there have been a lot of challenges. Definitely, as Lori mentioned, sort of not amplifying the mis and disinformation that we see has been a huge concern. And in the most recent days, the pandemic video that everybody has seen is sort of the perfect example of that. We, as reporters, as researchers, have been watching this narrative sort of bubble a couple of days before the pandemic video really blew up. We know that this researcher was attempting to push a version of her narrative. Sorry, not researcher, but the woman in the video was attempting to push a certain version of her narrative. And we also saw the word pandemic pop up here and there on social media, but we couldn't really cover it before it was widely seen because we were risking popularizing a narrative that hadn't previously been popularized. However, the narrative blew up so quickly that even though we sort of saw it coming from a distance, like the shark in Jaws, um, um, we took about a day to write a story to explain the falsehoods in the video, the people who are in the video, and sort of how the existing conspiracy narratives played into it. And between sort of the time where the piece of disinformation goes viral and where the first fact check goes up, is really the area where the most damage is done because it is a data void that is unfilled. It is when people are attempting to search something or attempting to figure out what the truth is and they can't. So for us, that has been an incredible challenge with the coronavirus. And the second challenge has really been explaining how different conspiratorial narratives with the 5G, with the vaccine science deniers, and with the politics are interplaying. A lot of people are not very receptive to conspiracy theories, the overarching conspiracy theories that are debunked. And that's because these narratives take a very long time to weave, and they really have a lot of true believers. Um, and sort of attempting to show people how those narratives have evolved over time. And the key people who were involved with that evolution, um, it has been quite tricky, and it's difficult to know what kind of impact this is having as social media networks are scrambling to figure out how to limit the spread of mis and disinformation online.
Mhm. Yeah, that's just fascinating. And it's even, the question of contributing to the spread is one that we also need to think about as we are designing survey questions. And are you going to ask the public about things that aren't true? Does that further it? How do we write about it? So it's definitely a huge challenge. And I'm curious, Philip, from your perspective as doing computation, studying computational propaganda, how the challenging aspect of trying to then convey that to leaders, to decision makers, to explain what it is you're seeing. It has that level of scientific and computational work behind it that can be hard to explain. I'd be curious to hear more about how you go about that.
Well, often, this is a good question. It often boils down to having a good story, having a good example of something that's, for political politicians, something that's clearly had an impact on the political process. And most people on both ends of the political spectrum um, greatly fear and dislike misinformation that undermines the voting process, that is about voter suppression, that is about not just sort of ideological spin, but reducing public trust in the process of an election. Um, Foreign interference is something that all of the major political parties would want to do something about. We have found it tough in that one of the solutions to the misinformation problem is to punish the politicians who are paying for it themselves. So as Jane points out, there's more and more PR agencies doing this work. It's often politicians in the heat of a campaign period whose campaign manager or a friend or an affinity group goes out and buys these ads or hires these trolls. And it's rare that it's actually traced back to the political figure. But in most democracies, you can fine politicians when they behave badly, but those fines haven't increased in recent years. The public agencies that would enforce them don't themselves have a lot of resources. So actually punishing the actors who pay for this stuff is really difficult.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. If we think about it then from the public perspective and sort of the public addressing it, I'd be curious in your thoughts, Lori, on how you manage, and if you think about that 71% number that I ended my slides with, of people feeling they need to take a break from COVID news. We've also had, a number of other times we've asked a question about news fatigue, where we see people just overwhelmed with the amount of information that's coming at them. How does that impact, if we think about the fact checking process and how you make decisions about what to choose to fact check and what not to? And then when you're giving those consumer tips, how that level of overwhelmness and fatigue factors into the decisions you all make.
Sure. Well, it's been interesting. We have really seen a large spike in readership and visits to our website during the coronavirus pandemic. And we suspect that a lot of those viewers are new, or people that maybe hadn't read our coverage before. And I think that, that's some indication to us that while people may be overwhelmed, they are searching for sources of information that can help them make sense of like you said, the sort of overwhelming cascade of information that's coming at them. So that's been, sort of a reassuring sign for us that people are seeking out the type of coverage that we can provide. And in terms of how we select what to fact check, I mean, honestly, we've been a little overwhelmed ourselves. There's been so many claims for us to write about, not just the viral things that we're talking about today, but also political claims related to the coronavirus. We've had a lot to do. But we look for, false claims, misleading claims. We tend not to write about things that are true unless it's something that would be very surprising to learn that, hey, this is true. So we're really looking for kind of the most damaging claims. And some of the misinformation stuff that we've dealt with that I think has been particularly important are claims that can be dangerous for people. These false cures, there was this idea that you should get this industrial bleach product that's marketed online as a cure for all kinds of things, false claims that we're in a nationwide lockdown that's about to be announced. So that those types of claims have been things that we've jumped on pretty quickly because they can be a danger to people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would guess you would go through a similar process, I think, of what Jane was talking about in terms of trying to figure out when something has had enough traction that you feel the need to get in that space versus it might be something that could be dangerous, but if few enough people have seemed to have been exposed to it that you'd rather wait and see if it hits the height of a time to dive in.
Yeah, I mean, that's always a tough question of when is the right time to get the fact check in to stop the spread of misinformation, get people the facts, but not, amplify the claim.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Jane, from your perspective as a journalist, as a reporter who is covering misinformation, right? That's whose job it is. You're writing about it. Again, in thinking about the connection with the public and readers, what's your response been? Do you feel a sense of more trust from readers, distrust? Are people really appreciative? And to what extent are you seeing this kind of beat reporter, I guess, be assigned across different news organizations?
We've definitely had a variety of responses. There's a lot of sort of harassment and disbelief that we've come to expect with covering disinformation. But there's also a lot of genuine confusion and genuine appreciation for the detailed type of fact checks that Lori and other debunkers and us that we all do. And one of the anecdotes that I use the most as a jumping off point to sort of talk about disinformation is I have this one woman who read one debunk of ours, who has grandchildren and clearly hasn't grown up using the internet, using social media the way that teens have, or even people from my generation. And every once in a while, she'll send me a genuine headline and ask if it's real. Because of how unbelievable, deeply unbelievable this moment really is for a lot of people. And disinformation really plays into that. So there is definitely a real thirst and a real audience, like Lori mentioned, that is trying to get the facts, is trying to get the story straight, but there are a series of barriers standing in the way. And I think that it's incredibly important to mention that one of the key barriers standing in the way is the way that social media is structured as a whole. We have been talking about social media and reporting about social media and its role in the spread of disinformation for almost 4 years now. In the US, that conversation really started in 2016. In other countries, that conversation has been happening for much longer.
Mm-hmm.
And as we report on this, something that we hear again and again from academics, from researchers, is that a lot of the infrastructure that they have been warning about over the last few years is still in place and is really contributing to this problem in ways that we were sort of already aware of, that policymakers were already aware of, that reporters were already aware of, that debunkers were already aware of. So I would say that yes, there's definitely people who are absolutely looking to get good information. But sometimes getting to that good information, depending on the online ecosystem you've built for yourself, and the speed with which debunks come, the effectiveness with which data voids are filled, can really present a lot of barriers to that.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, that's really interesting. And then if we think about the sort of the trajectory of some of these claims and the degree to which some have, when we look at the numbers of the actual reach, if you're looking at social media, you're pulling together that computational data, Philip, is that some actually, like, the numbers, looks like they're not reaching that many people. Like, they seem more small scale in terms of what their actual their reach is in terms of numbers. Others that have much wider reach. And so I guess one of my questions is, to what degree can there be like smaller reach but still large impact? Or how does sort of the level of impact connect to the reach? And are there areas where, the impact is really can still be quite significant, even if that reach is smaller?
Small. Yeah, I think it was actually one of your Pew surveys that run after the 2016 election, maybe 5 or 6 months, that showed that the percentage of American voters who still thought Hillary Clinton was involved with something to do with the pizzeria was not insignificant, and it skewed younger. So I think your instinct is right that the misinformation doesn't always last. It's the uncertainty that lasts. There's still a portion of the public who will hold on to some fragment they've heard um, from a source they can't name. And in this case, with COVID in particular, those kinds of myths and misinformation can prove deadly. Now, I think the social media firms, it's taken a long time for them to start to engage and take this seriously. As Lori pointed out, what they do to help users flag has changed. And some good things that have come out of COVID is, I think, the way the platforms are adapting. We did a study recently of YouTube on search on YouTube and found that the average user using pretty traditional COVID health related terms wouldn't encounter much misinformation. They got stuff from professional news organizations. They wouldn't get stuff from the WHO or CDC or public health professionals. But the clear misinformation stuff, you have to hunt for it. There'll always be a small audience for that misinformation, but it's not the mainstream voter that is the audience for misinformation.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Lori or Jane, have any thoughts to add up to that?
I just wanted to follow up that point very quickly, where one of the sort of next steps for social media platforms to dive into is how the entire social media ecosystem functions. So we are absolutely seeing that YouTube is recommending fewer of those videos with bad information in them. And likewise, we're seeing those fact checks on Facebook and a demotion of content that they very frequently talk about. But when the entire social media system is engaged, uh, that is not something that social media companies have gotten comfortable encountering. And in particular, the pipeline that we've seen the most effective is the creation of a YouTube video that does not get recommended by YouTube. That YouTube video then being spread on Facebook groups specifically, which are some of the least moderated spaces on Facebook because they rely on self-moderation, and that can be a pretty flawed system. And then they go out into the mainstream. So as these platforms have been adapting, so have the tactics of the bad actors who are attempting to spread their message.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, Jane, any thoughts as I know you all focus on Facebook content. Or Lori, sorry.
Jamie,
I'm looking
okay.
at Lori and I'm saying
It's
Jane.
okay. Yeah, I
Sorry.
mean, I will say we don't have a great system right now for looking at how information might be spreading on other types of platforms. In other countries, they deal with WhatsApp a lot, misinformation being spread from WhatsApp, and we are not actively monitoring anything like that yet. However, I will say we often see, if we find a claim being spread on Twitter, we find the same claim on Facebook, we find the same claim on Instagram. So often these posts are sort of blanketed across platforms. And I would kind of go back to the predispositions point that I made earlier. A lot of the most popular claims we see are similar types of themes. Somebody wants to take away your Social Security or spend that money. We see those claims all the time, or claims about Congress getting perks that the average American doesn't. We see those types of claims come up again and again. And we've seen that through anonymous emails more than a decade ago, and now they just continue to live on through these different social media platforms.
Yeah. We are about out of time. Philip, I'm going to give you the last words. If you have any final thoughts you wanted to share, circle back, and then we'll close out.
Thank you. Well, I just offer that there's many different ways to tackle the problem, and in part it's up to us to keep our social media feeds clean and clear of people we don't know, sources we can't trust, and not to share information that we haven't validated ourselves. It's also up to the social media firms to follow through and stay diligent. It's the platforms themselves that serve vast amounts of misinformation before people vote. And we want them to serve the high quality stuff so voters have good decisions when it comes to that special day in November 2020.
Thank you. And thanks to all of you for the work you're doing, for all that you shared today. Thank you to South by Southwest for letting us, supporting this virtual method of having our conversation. I found it really fascinating. And thanks to all of you all who may be logging in and watching this at different times as it's available through the South by Southwest portal and I think other places in social media. This is certainly a challenge and a part of our environment of information that is not going to be going away anytime soon. So I do look forward to continuing to follow the work of each of you and continuing to learn more. Thank you all very much.